Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Dave Archard, and along with Emma Cave, who will now wave, um, we are the co-investigators on a British Academy project which is looking at ethics and ethics committees in the pandemic. And this is being conducted by means of webinars, and this is the fifth of 6 webinars with a final conference scheduled, hopefully, face-to-face in July. This webinar is on the constitution and role of ethics committees, who gets to be on them and what exactly is it that they do. Those of you who've been before will know that the format is a fairly standard one. We have a panel of speakers.
Okay, Dave's frozen a little there. Hopefully he will unfreeze very soon. So if I can just continue until he comes back. So massive welcome to everybody, to our attendees and to our 4 fantastic speakers. It's very rare to find Dave so silent. So okay, so the format will be today that we'll have each of the panelists giving a short talk on their experiences and their views on the constitution and the form of clinical ethics committees. And after each talk, we'll have a few minutes wherein each of the panelists will have a chance to respond to the talk that has just been, and perhaps ask questions of each other. So we aim for a sort of quite conversational way of dealing with things, as you'll probably be aware if you've been to some of our other webinars. And then at the end, we hope then to have time for Q&A from our attendees. So if you do have a question as you're going along, you don't have to wait to the end to form your question. Please use the Q&A function and put in that Q&A function who your question is for, which one of the speakers. And then towards the end, we'll be able to direct that question to the right person. And here comes Dave back again. Hi, Dave.
Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. I think my internet crashed.
No worries.
Nothing to do with the state of Northern Union, I can assure you. Otherwise, we'd all be terrified. Right, I think I pointed out that we are recording these, and hopefully they'll all appear up on the website for the project, which you can find by going to Emma's personal webpage and then click and follow. Without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Emma, who will actually chair the session, and then I'll make some concluding comments at the end about next steps. Over to you, Emma. Could I just, oh, sorry, I think I should have said that we're going to ask everybody who's not speaking to mute, just so that it kills the background noise. Thanks. Over to you, Emma.
Okay, thank you. Well picked up. Yeah, so I continued a little after you were talking, after you disappeared for a while, Dave. And so I think everybody understands the format. And to put their questions in the Q&A, and we can therefore proceed with our first speaker, who is John Coggon. John is a Professor of Law at the University of Bristol and also an honorary member of the UK Faculty of Public Health. So very warm welcome to you, John, and if you'd like to share your slides and take it away. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much to Dave and Emma for inviting me to speak. And to everyone who's listening today. As you will see from the title I've given to this, I'm focusing within the remit of the overall session, in particular on the question of the function of ethics committees, clinical ethics committees. And what I want to draw out in this talk is questions of competence. And I mean that in a sort of formal regulatory sense. And I want to question the function and functionality of ethics committees where the system as a whole can't be seen to be ethically authoritative. So the core focus and argument then in my short talk, I am going to look at this, broadly speaking, through a framing based in regulation. And I'll go on to explain that presently. But I'm looking at the idea of clinical decision making that is governed, and this needn't be taken as an ordinal ranking, but by law, by broad questions of social ethics, as well as narrower questions of medical ethics, and then issues of professional and personal judgment on the part of practitioners. As I've indicated, the talk's focus refers to the function of ethical guidance. And here I mean guidance given sort of directly in a discursive sense by a committee, but also guidance drawn up by a committee. And I want to look at those questions in the context of a system as a whole that aims to assure good medical practice. So I framed this with reference to Jose Miola's book from 2007, It's a lovely picture of it in the corner. And I think that that's a really key work on the relationships between ethics, law, regulation, and medical practice. And when I read Jose's work, I suggest that the question that he's really asking us is what sorts of regulation are required best to assure good medical practice in different instances? And I think that we would see the role of clinical ethics committees as falling within the umbrella of his answer to that question. Now, I don't have lots of time today, so I won't go too much detail into this, but it requires us to think about what regulation means in a complex and varied institutional context, such as is provided by the National Health Service, what the good in good medical practice means. And just quickly to provide an answer to that, I think that means good both in the sense that it conforms with robust ethical and legal standards, and that it's consistent with the exercise of professional skill. So we recognize medical expertise as well as something over and above or distinct to that. And we recognize that it has to apply good medical practice within different instances. So one size will not fit all. Before I get accused of being a lawyer and pulling us towards law, I just want to be clear as well that when I refer to regulation, I'm doing so in a very broad sense. And I take the canonical definition from Hood, Rothstein, and Baldwin and say we have a regulatory system if we have a system which sets standards, gathers information or monitors, and which modifies behavior. So I'm not just interested in legal regulation here, I'm interested in the regulation of a system as a whole, including but not limited through legal measures. So I don't have time to speak about the totality, and I will therefore pull us towards ethical guidance. And here I draw from the work of two experts in public health ethics, Angus Dawson and Adrian Vians, respectively. Adrian's chapter features in a book on which I'm an author, but he was the lead on this chapter. And between work that they've done, we see a taxonomy that provides 4 different purposes for ethical guidance. It can be to increase ethical awareness. So we use it to draw out the value-focused aspects of decisions beyond technical scientific issues. It can be directly to provide ethical action guidance. So it just tells users what they ought to do if they are to behave according to an ethical standard. It can be used to facilitate ethical deliberation. So here, the users of the guidance then apply their own ethical knowledge and understanding to a problem and go through a process, for example, of balancing or some other systematized or structured method. So for example, they see a list of principles enumerated and work out how to mediate between them to come to an ethical answer to a question. And finally, ethical guidance might be about explaining basic ethical justification. So going down to the level of theory and explaining why a particular principle or policy or action is the right or the best one. So I think we can take these to be broadly covering the sorts of remits that would be encompassed by ethics committees. But again, they happen in a wider context. So when I was talking about Jose's book, I said, of course, we have the law. Now, one of the great challenges as we entered the pandemic and the more hard-pressed government responses to it, so going back almost a year to around March last year, was that we needed to know how ethical guidance could accord with law. It might be thought, well, let's just go and look at the law on this and let's go and look at the statute. First of all, the Coronavirus Act 2020 itself is utterly enormous and pretty difficult to read, even if you're an excellent lawyer. If you're a non-excellent lawyer like me, it's quite hard to read. And if you're not a lawyer at all, I think you've got quite limited hope. And that hope shrinks further when we see actually that's just a relatively small part of the picture. We've got background, wider legal concerns that will constrain activities. We've got legislation that's been amended, legislation whose application has changed. And this is being balanced then against other public health legislation and other sources and forms of professional and public guidance. So what are we to do in trying to get past that? Well, I was pleased to be part of a collaborative project with colleagues in Belfast, Cardiff, and Edinburgh, where we sought to help ethics committees, help practitioners, and help members of the public better to understand this complex framework. But at base, I don't think, however well we can explain those things, we can make up for gaps that are left. So I've explained the remit of ethics, and I've explained the importance of law. And I think where the COVID pandemic and our responses to it have left gaps there is a problem if those gaps aren't filled by the relevant authoritative actor within the system, and that can mean government. So here I refer to a paper that I wrote early on, or an opinion piece that I wrote early on in the pandemic with Dr. Sadie Regmi. And we were concerned at that stage about the omission, which has endured, to provide guidance on prioritization beyond clinical judgment. There were three problems in particular that we highlighted there, and I don't think we've got past them, and I think they're problems for law as well as ethics. So one is when we're looking at questions of prioritization, whether in a pandemic context or otherwise, it is a matter of principle as far as I can see, not just fact, that there is going to be disagreement that is reasonable between different ethical positions. There will be substantive disagreement between ethical views that can claim to objectivity, can say that they are persuasive to an impartial actor who is responsive to good or persuasive reasons. Second of all, if we don't have authoritative structures in place to address these questions, then we will see systematized effects happening out as a matter of fact. So someone has to make the decision, and we will see potentially greater disparities that we don't want to see, or otherwise problematic practice that we would wish to avoid, just as a matter of what happens in a vacuum. Finally, from the perspective of practitioners, there were concerns, real concerns, that they may fall foul of the law, not because of not caring about the law, but because of not understanding what was legally required and wanting the sort of authoritative statement on that that could not be provided by an ethics advisor. So that led me and Sadie to conclude that as well as being practically clear and direct, materials such as decision-making allocation tools must be based on transparent, fair, legally supported principles. Guidance in which the public and physicians can be confident cannot, therefore, just be about individual documents, however well drafted. They rely on the coherence and clarity of the system as a whole. If the vacuum is to be filled, government's part in this is essential. In other words, it wouldn't be good enough just for an ethics body to provide absolutely excellent ethical advice here, because to be authoritative, something further was needed. When we're thinking about how to achieve that, I have suggested that there are 4 key frames that ought to underpin legal regulation, but through the argument's continuance, that would apply then to guidance that purports to be consistent with it, to fill it out further. These are transparency and clarity, a willingness to accept scrutiny, proper respect for human rights, and respect for the rule of law. And one of the things that we might find startling in the situation, if not March last year, then by now, is that scholars, such as me, commentators, feel the need to advocate for these as important principles and values that need to be upheld. So in conclusion, I think it's important to look at ethics functions, the functions of ethics committees, under a lens of regulation for good practice, for good clinical practice. We should focus on express and authoritative discussion of the system as a whole. So I don't believe we can have a complete discussion if we just look at clinical ethics committees in isolation. We need to look at the values of the system as a whole and concerns for assuring institutional integrity. Even if we have substantially excellent guidance, it alone may not be adequate. So we look at what makes the system itself morally authoritative, just rather than just parts of it. And my closing statement is that the system ought to address ethical questions well ahead of time. And I think that's just good practice, but it also offers the widest scope in time for consultation and so on to underpin the guidance that we would wish to produce. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. That was a fabulous start, really making us think about the context in which ethics committees are working and functioning. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to any of our panelists that might have questions for John or comments that they want to make. So does anybody have a comment or question? Yeah, Amel, go ahead.
Thanks, John. That was really interesting. Certainly the experience we've had in the hospital and based that is it was because of the lack of government guidance on how to prioritise patients that the hospitals themselves have had to come up with their own frameworks to do so. And they were bombarded by ethical guidance from the BMA, from the Royal Colleges, from the GMC. And when you looked at it, all the ethical guidance was really useless. It was quite generic. It didn't tell you, the key thing you said, John, about how do you reconcile ethical conflicts. It didn't give any practical guidance on how to do that. And so there was lots of ethical guidance being given, but none that was very useful, and the government completely failed in England to give any, and the guidance in Scotland arguably wasn't that useful. So I think that's a really important point, John.
Thank you ever so much, Amel. I don't know if I should respond or if someone else wants to. Well, I mean, it seems we're in agreement. So the response isn't terribly interesting, but I'm invigorated by your agreement, Amel, especially based on your experience in the committee there. I haven't sat on a clinical ethics committee for some years. I'm on other ethics committees. But this rush to identify appropriate principles and so on could only assuage some of the problems that I identify there, and especially in that paper with Sadie, if we don't attend to the whole. And I think it's a failing that is one of the significant lessons in relation to ethics in the pandemic for me.
Okay, right. So people can save their questions which we'll come to at the end. So again, feel free, please, to write your questions in the Q&A. We've got one already. Please keep on doing that, and we'll come to those towards the end when we've had all the presentations. And with that, then we can then move on. Thank you very much, John. To Juliet. So our next speaker, Juliet, is Director of Policy and Partnerships at the Health Research Authority. And Juliet's going to bring us the benefit of her very extensive experience in relation to research ethics committees and their role in the pandemic. So thank you, Juliet, if you'd like to share your slides.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks very much for inviting me to talk at this seminar today. As Emma said, I wanted to talk to you about research ethics committees and our experience of running a research ethics service during the COVID-19 pandemic. I've worked at the HRA for 3 years, so I'm not sure how extensive my research ethics committee experience is, but I've worked in around ethics committees and regulation for a long time, both at the BMA Ethics Committee, but also the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority Ethics Committee as well. So come at this as a kind of jobbing civil servant, and how ethics and ethics committees plays a part in the kind of regulatory process. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what we've done differently at the HRA through Research Ethics Review during the last year, but also what we've done exactly the same as we normally do and why. And then end with talking about what we might do differently in the future. So I'm coming at this from a kind of service provision point of view, I suppose, rather than the kind of the nature of the discussion, although that will no doubt come up. So firstly, then to talk a little bit about what research ethics committees look like before COVID. And those of you in research that need NHS Rec Review will be familiar with this. So in the HRA is an England-only arm's length body of the Department of Health and Social Care, but we coordinate with the Research Ethics Service across the UK. We run our own English ethics committees. So most of the data here I'm presenting and the experience is about English ethics committees, but much is the same from Ethics Review, whether you're in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales or England. But we have 64 research ethics committees across England, as I said, as part of a UK service. And those recs review 4,500 new research studies each year in health and social care. And the committees themselves are made up of around 850 volunteers. The chairs have an honorarium of about £3,500 per year, but everybody else is unpaid, apart of course from the staff at the HRA and the devolved administration equivalent who are supporting those ethics committees. Half of the membership are professional, to have a clinical background or a scientific background that's relevant, and half are lay. And we have this odd concept of lay and lay plus people, who are kind of people who used to be classed as professionals but are no longer, and people who've never been near a clinic or a lab in their lives. So before the pandemic, all of those meetings were in person and happened in various different locations around the country. some in far-flung places, some in city centres. And we've always encouraged researchers and research sponsors and others involved in the study to attend part of the meeting to have a conversation about the research study proposal. And that was quite patchy before COVID happened. Busy clinicians found it quite difficult to attend. Some of them were able to dial in on very poor technology. But we definitely knew that it's beneficial to have a researcher in the room because there are a lot of questions that can be answered very quickly, but also having a dialogue and a conversation about the research is really, really fruitful. And from a kind of service provision point of view, the decision was communicated to applicants within 10 working days of the REC meeting. So that's the kind of structural side of things, I suppose. On the approach, the committee reviews a written application that's submitted through a UK service, and it's the discussion takes place in a committee setting. Occasionally there are lighter touch reviews that happen of studies with minimal ethical issues that are done by correspondence, but most is done in committee. And there are a set range set out in legislation as to what kinds of opinions a committee can give. So they are part of the regulatory process in that you can't proceed with a study that falls into the remit of REC review without a favourable opinion from an ethics committee, and you can't publish the findings of that research either. So they are a kind of a gatekeeper, if you like, as well as playing a role, which is about kind of challenge and dialogue and discussion and opening up a conversation with the researchers, perhaps about things they hadn't thought of, ethical issues they hadn't considered, and providing some, support at times as well. Sometimes with student research, people are often very new to this game and learn a lot by going through the ethics review process. So that's pre-COVID. I've highlighted in blue the bits that have been different during COVID. And that's partly in relation to research, which is COVID-19 research itself, but it's also about how the service works in the context of a global pandemic when we're all working at home. So very early on, the Chief Medical Officer established a process for identifying urgent public health research that was largely funded by NIHR, but not entirely. And they identified a handful of studies that they wanted to be set up as quick as humanly possible. And we already had a pandemic kind of REC review process that had been used in previous emergency pandemic research settings. So it had a process that we could take off the shelf, but needed to tweak it so that some of those really urgent studies could be through the regulatory process in 24 to 36 hours. It's a process that normally takes about 30 to 60 days. So the RECs reorganised themselves, we reorganised the RECs to meet on an ad hoc basis so that some of those early studies that got set up quickly, like the recovery trial, for example, which went from idea to first patient in 9 days, was reviewed in a 24-hour period. And those urgent public health studies were primarily vaccine and therapy trials. So we had to work in a much more ad hoc way, pull people from different committees to be able to provide a committee structure very quickly. And of course, switch to virtual meetings like everybody else has. And because of the focus on speed, provided an opinion usually within 1 working day. Depended on the type of COVID-19 research, it could be a little bit longer if it was less urgent, but generally done within 1 working day. So structurally was quite different. And also we benefited from not benefited, is the wrong way to say it. There was a 30% reduction in all other types of research. So that normal annual amount of 4,500 studies coming through for review, there was a 30% reduction in those last summer. So we were able to deal with a little bit more capacity in the system to be able to respond very quickly to the urgent ones. But in terms of the approach, exactly the same, just done more quickly. So papers are reviewed more quickly and the outcomes were communicated more quickly, but the approach in the meeting was the same, at least using the same ethical domains, the same type of consideration, the same emphasis, in fact, a greater emphasis on researchers being in the room, bringing their research sponsoring on organisation and ideally bringing their public contributors as well, patients who work with them to help design the study. but provided exactly the same kind of challenge. I think probably we're much more focused on the important issues, which is something that I wanted to come back to. So this just gives a quick visual of the timelines. You know, I work in a regulator, we think about KPIs a lot, which is perhaps anathema to thinking about ethical questions, but that's the reality. So the top line shows the fast track review process. So ethics review sits within a wider approvals process for clinical trials and other types of research. So not only did we do the rec review quickly, but the governance approvals done and the information about the approved study being published was also done in a very quick turnaround. So it's obviously part of a kind of wider approach where we're as a review body are providing guidance for researchers and responding to what issues they were dealing with early on in the pandemic. So lots of questions around how you ask for people to consent to a trial where social distancing and infection control measures are in place, where there are a lot of patients who are not conscious or not able to consent without use of someone to consent on their behalf, and how you get access to those people, etc. So lots of questions around that. And you know, we were helping shepherd researchers through the whole process much more than we normally do, making information about approved research proposals, studies published on our website very quickly. There was one thing that slipped and has been quite a focus of the learning since, which is that it's now a kind of standard and expected approach to designing a research study with human participants is that you design that study in collaboration with patients or members of the public who might benefit from a research proposal of that kind. And our ethics committees would, as part of their review, ask about what kind of public involvement has taken place in that project. Not because it's the right thing to do, although it is, but more because it helps to address the ethical issues in the study itself. So is the intervention tolerated by participants? Is it addressing a research need in that particular patient population? And is the information and the consent materials written in such a way that will be helpful and meaningful to participants such that they would want to join and they would want to stay in that study? We saw a huge reduction in the rates of public involvement. We ask a question about it when people apply for ethics review, and took some steps very quickly to address that. It dropped from around 80% of people saying they had involved the public in their study design to 20% in the very early days of COVID-19 research proposals. Thankfully, it's now back up to north of 80%, but that was something that I can talk about the details. I haven't got time to talk about it now, why that happened and what we did to address it. But it was one area of good ethical practice which slipped in times of emergency. So just finally, I just wanted to getting back on some of the structural and approach side of things. We're thinking now about what we want to keep and what we want to bin as a result of this process. Lots of regulatory bodies, and I'm sure lots of other organisations and institutions that you're involved with are now thinking about what life looks like differently from when we return to some element of normal working. We'll probably keep virtual meetings. If you're on a rec, then keep that to yourselves, because we haven't made that final decision yet. But we're certainly meeting virtually until the end of September this year, and I think are considering very carefully about probably retaining that, not because it's cheaper, but because it enables greater participation from researchers and sponsors. We want to keep a fast track approach for prioritised research. Important question about what is to be prioritised, what is the most important research. To focus on the important ethical issues, to let go of the crossing the T's and the dotting the I's on participant information sheets and focus on things like, have the patients helped to design the study? Does it address the ethical questions that they've identified? We're not going to go back to crazy hours of working and ad hoc meetings, but we do want to do a piece of work on how to get greater consistency of approach between recs, because one thing that a national emergency has done is focused minds and let people and encourage people to let slide the things that aren't really that important. If you had all day and you weren't trying to set up research quickly, then maybe you could cross all the T's and dot all the I's, but it's important for a service to focus on addressing the ethical issues so that the research can start, so ethical research can start as quickly as possible. Lots more work to do in getting REC to take a more consistent approach to review of studies, and that's something that will keep us busy for the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliet. That was fabulous. So interesting to hear how you've adapted, and also to hear about some of the issues you had with public participation, which I think there are strong links there between some of your experiences and experience also with regards to the development of guidance by clinical ethics committees. And also very interesting to see that there are elements of the revised practice that you're going to keep, you know, that we've learned things from this pandemic and can actually do some things better as a result of it. I think is really interesting. So turning now to the panel to see if you have any questions for Juliet. Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
First of all, thank you for your presentation and for the amazing work that the HRA did to try to keep up. I think when people talk about the vaccines and stuff, the work of the research ethics committees needs to be kept in mind. Having just stepped down after an extended term of office as the chair of a REC, one thing that has interested me and kind of fits in with your PPI question is, I think it's question 34, because we look at it all the time on the IRAS, but the one about what kind of considerations are made for people who are non-English speakers. And we do still find a huge amount of that, people saying, well, I don't have the money for interpreters, or these particular questionnaires have just been validated in the English language. And yet there's a lot out there. And I think the REC that I served felt very strongly that there needed to be a bit more teeth to that question, because it does kind of fit into the PPI thing, which is showing an increase again. And just wondered what your thoughts were.
Thanks, Jim. And thanks very much for that compliment about the role of the REC. I think they're amazing. And yes, I think your experience on the REC that you shared is common across all of them. A lot of frustration at a sort of lack of attention paid to making sure that people whose first language isn't English can participate in a trial. It's certainly something that the National Institute of Health Research are really wanting to embed in their funding allocation and the consideration of their sort of grant giving. And they've got a big focus on research for underserved communities, and translation is part of that drive. There's always a dilemma with research ethics committees, because we're a gateway to starting research, about how much you stop the study in its tracks at what is almost the last point before that study is able to start up in the NHS, or where it's a phase 1 in a phase 1 unit. So there's always a balance about how much you say, well, this is an issue that we need to influence research funders and sponsors further up the food chain, and not do it on a study by study basis, which I think is definitely true of this. But at the same time, making sure that we do bite them when they come through the REC at times, using the teeth analogy, because there's no point in just trying to influence good practice way before they come in for what is effectively a regulatory approval, and then just kind of letting, you know, less than good applications kind of sail by. So there's always a tension there, but I think it's definitely something we want to focus on much more. What the sanction might be, I don't know. Whether you say, actually, you can't, unless you have a really good reason why you're not translating this material for non-English speakers, then you don't get your favourable opinion. Or whether we try and tackle it at a sponsor level, I don't know. There's a couple of options about how we could do it, but it's definitely something that's on our minds.
Fabulous. Any other questions? I mean, one thing that was occurring to me as you were speaking, that was perhaps with if any of our panelists who are also clinical ethics committee members could maybe say anything about parallels that you see between research ethics committees and the constitution of the clinical ethics committees. So, for example, Juliet was talking about it being 50% lay and 50% professional. Is there a sort of similarity, or are there massive differences in when it comes to clinical ethics committees? Yeah, I go for it, Amel.
I think sometimes it's quite hard to find lay people, especially with the quick response to the COVID pandemic. I know we struggle to find lay people that would be representative. There is now especially given how sensitive some of the topics are, to make sure that there was representation from faith groups and also disability support groups, etc., which is really important in these ethics committees.
Okay, thanks, brilliant. So we'll move on then to Jim. So Jim, thank you, and welcome to you as well. The Reverend Jim Linthicum is a healthcare chaplain and clinical ethics committee member at Great Ormond Street Hospital. So thanks so much. Please go ahead and share your slides.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you for the opportunity to share today. I have to say, I Googled the other speakers and was quite overwhelmed looking at their CVs, and I've really enjoyed the first two and look forward to you also, Amel. And you've already touched on the issue of faith, which is what I'm going to particularly be looking at. Now, I have a lot of interest in all sorts of areas of clinical ethics, and one that you looked at, John, was the whole competencies and who do we have sitting at the table and how are different opinions represented. But being a healthcare chaplain, probably one of the main things is the role of the faith group in clinical ethics and on the committees. I want to start just, these are quite basic definitions, but just so people know, this is hopefully, so we're all speaking the same language: moral, concerned with the principles of right and wrong behavior; ethics, the moral principles that govern a person's behavior; spirituality, I think, is important because even chaplaincy has kind of veered away from this idea of pure religion, and spirituality has many definitions. This is just one of those. Theology, because I'll be talking about theology and religion together. So really, religion is something that tends to be studied sometimes by theology, among other things. And then faith, and I think I put the one that people have the most issues with at the end, because many people believe that faith is a belief that is not based on proof. And while in the beginning, when clinical ethics committees began, sort of the mid 1900s, there was a certain amount of religious presence on those committees. A couple things need to be borne in mind. Some of those committees were just started as a single issue type of thing. So for example, the court in New Jersey wanted a clinical ethics committee adjourned or brought together because of the Karen Ann Quinlan case. And so there were cases, and here again in the 70s or 80s, there were questions of equipment availability. I do say, as an American and having sat on a clinical ethics committee over there, sometimes I do think it's another way to cover yourself, particularly in a very litigious society. So I show that not only because I think it's a quite funny slide, but also everybody knows when we talk about somebody playing God. And there is still that image of God, but there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think one of the reasons that religion has fallen out of favor in terms of presence on clinical ethics committees, well, I think there's several. The first one is that people feel that faith is a personal matter. So how can one person represent not only one particular faith, but the multiplicity of faiths and cultures that we tend to have to deal with? Also, there is the seemingly irrational thought process, certainly in comparison to scientific materialistic ways of thinking. And finally, one thing people feel about religion is over the centuries, it has been something that has created conflict rather than harmony. I might challenge that a bit because sometimes I think politics plays on using religious terms to define their own needs where they're not particularly religiously based. If you look at Great Ormond Street Hospital, and this is a quite old slide, but if you look at the reasons for lack of consensus in end-of-life decision-making, you see religion is a player, not a huge one. Interestingly, the difficulties between parents and teams kind of take the biggest share, and then communication, which I think is always an ongoing thing. However, if you look at the use of support services, you find that in the first in-house consensus, you only have ethics consultation being higher than that combined group of multi-faith chaplains, second opinion, symptom care, and PALS. And then if you look at where there's been no consensus reached, here again, other than Powell's, religion is up there. So obviously, I think the statistics show there is a part to play. The other thing is, and I love this quote, that religion deserves a place here in secular medicine because it is not simply or uniquely irrational. I think that's a statement about all sorts of the players who sit at the clinical ethics table, and sometimes more assumed rationality than perhaps is actually there, but I cannot judge on that. So what would they bring to the clinical ethics table? It's a meta-narrative, one of many. And as you know, in this more narrative-based time, we talk a lot about people's stories. And the meta-narrative of a faith tends to give a bigger, all-embracing, all-encompassing umbrella narrative that people look at. And often there's an assumption that people are aware of that and know what that is. And in conversation, when people share their narratives, their ability to talk within the meta-narrative is important. Second of all, it's very representative. I mean, one of the things I was interested in what John said about reading the act about COVID and about how if you're not a lawyer, and it's so many things that happen in ethics aren't really things that a lot of the people who certainly come to our rapid reviews would necessarily understand. Concepts like consequentialism, virtue ethics, deontology, they've heard the terms, and the greatest good for the greatest number is something that does resonate with some people, but they do have more their own story and their own understanding of how to relate. And within the theological framework, it's perhaps something that can be articulated more clearly. It's also anchored because it's something that has gone through the ages, although that can sometimes be a curse as well as a blessing. It's enlivening. Faith is what brings a lot of people their passion. And whether we agree with what they're saying, at least we can interact with that passion, and it becomes the face of ethics. I thought, as I was thinking about this, I thought, who has been the face of the COVID crisis? And I can't think of a whole lot of ethicists who would immediately spring to mind. We have, in some ways, in terms of information giving, our chief medical officers, but probably the biggest face in this country has been Captain Tom, who was really about bringing everything to life and looking. We talk a lot about well-being, but seeing what can actually be done. Within the ethics committee, there has to be something that I think is life-giving, enlivening, and can be the face of the bigger issues. There's a shared language and tradition when you talk about the different faiths, and I am going to address that question of, with the multiplicity of faiths, how do you do this? But one thing we found is often, let's say we have a Muslim family who is having a rapid review, they would like to have a Muslim chaplain there because of the shared language and tradition. They're not always as shared as people think they are, but at least it's the beginning of a common language. It is interpretive, some of the phrases that are used. I think all of us who sit on clinical ethics committees interpret things in the light of our own vocation, and faith and religion and theology are one such thing. It's rooted and dynamic. It has a history, but it hasn't stopped. Although some people think it has, that God continues to be a man with long white hair and a white beard. I'm conscious that one of the things I love about The Simpsons the most is you never see God's face. So you still have a bit of that rooting, but there's a bit more openness to what could happen. And it offers what I would call an anthropology of reality and possibility. Possibility, the idea that no matter what the faith, there's this idea of being created in the image of a God or the God, which kind of makes so many things possible. At the same time, and something that many folks, including myself, find a bit uncomfortable, is this idea of sinfulness. So there is an idea of a brokenness to our anthropology as well that we can sometimes bring in. So what would be expected of religion and theology at the table? First of all, expertise beyond the parochial. You can't have somebody who just knows about their own limited group, and sometimes scholars of religion can be as good as specific faith representatives because they know a lot of the mutual and shared dynamics. But it is important you don't have somebody who is so blinkered. And if you look interestingly at this new moral and ethical advisory group that has begun, some of the titles that people are given, things like providing insight as to Jewish views, providing insight as to Christian views. So in some ways you might have people who can simply talk about that one more unique situation. These people should have access to resources, both human and information. Who do you invite? There has to be that ability to listen and articulate. And I don't always know if religion has always been good at listening. One person once said about the church that it thinks it has answers to the questions, but how rarely does it question the answers? And then finally, there has to be a commitment to process, shared aims, and willingness to continue to update. Once again, this idea to listen, that we are not the only show in town, and in fact are becoming less and less seemingly relevant, and why a presentation like this might not even need to happen. And so finally, just a couple quotes I'd like to end with, that one should not approach the issue of the contribution of theology to bioethics on the assumption that there exists some independent realm of secular philosophical discourse, privileged as more reasonable, neutral, or objective, and less tradition-bound than religious discourse. And I think particularly with science, we do see that some groups perhaps do see themselves as, because they're less tradition-bound, they are more neutral and objective. And that's for discussion. I'm interested to hear what your questions are. And here it is a quote that talks about the religious communities and theological traditions, the idea of alternative imaginations, alternative ways of interpretation. And finally, what I'd like to end with is something that I say in all of our multi-faith and multicultural teaching, is just because we think we know about any faith, we shouldn't really assume. We need to be willing to listen. And there are structures into which we can fit it, but at the same time, we need to look at the broad spectrum of belief, but have some idea of how belief works, how it motivates, and the anthropology it brings. So thank you for listening. And are there any questions?
Thanks very much, Jim. That was a fascinating exploration of the many benefits a faith person can bring to the table. So our panelists, any questions? Yes, John.
Thanks, Jim. I thought that was really good talk. Consistent with what you were saying, you raised questions at the end instead of purporting to have the answer. But your question one there was a question that I was wanting to pose to you as you progressed, and you contrasted faith-based deliberation with scientific deliberation, and it was a very powerful idea you presented. Who would be the face of ethics in the pandemic, and trying to find a kind of person to stand at the other podium apart from that occupied by Chris Whitty, and part of, I think, the poverty, where there has been poverty in discourse around values, is that ethics has been sucked out, and what has been described as science has been allowed to overlay the terrain that's then otherwise left exposed. Which is, again, sorry, a horribly long preamble. Just how would you answer question one? How do you distinguish the faith-based reasoning from other philosophical, ethical reasoning, but that clearly isn't scientific reasoning in the way you were describing?
Well, I think that, as I said, it's one narrative of many, one meta-narrative of many, which is why I'm not looking for any exclusivity. I think in terms of who would be the face from a theological point of view, is perhaps I'd use the literary analogy of sometimes I think what theology and religion bring are the poetry. They're a bit harder to interpret sometimes, and they also avail themselves of a variety of very personal interpretations. But that does not mean that they don't have a role to play. And that's why, as I said in the definition of spirituality, things like hope and meaning are all things we share. And perhaps that's what we bring, is the analysis of that. And many scriptures themselves are not just one thing. They're history, they're poetry, they're ethics, they're ways people are told to bring their life. So I don't know how much that's helping, but I think that's what they would bring to the face of the situation.
If I may, I mean, just quick, I mean, consistent or otherwise with that answer. I mean, are philosophers poets, or do they write in prose?
I think you need to ask the philosopher. I would say sometimes they write in poetry either informed by or to inform prose. And I think that's the difference, because it's a bit more directive than religion should be. I'm not saying it's not. One of the big problems with religion is it is so directive, and particularly in areas that don't really mesh with the different scriptures that are being used. But so yeah, that maybe that's a get out. But I do find a lot of poetry and philosophy, but it is informing to get to a certain point. And that's a much more general thing than I think the personal poetry of spirituality and religion.
Go ahead, Amel.
Thanks. Really interesting discussion between John and you, Jim. Jim, I really liked your talk, and I think there's definitely a need for that representation on ethics panels, certainly in the context of children medicine and some of the controversial decisions that there have been. Religion has such a major role to play in all of them. So if you think about Rita and the conjoined twins, it was the parents' devout Roman Catholic principles which was leading them to withhold consent to the separation. With Great Ormond Street, the famous Charlie Gard case, to Alder Hey with Alfie Evans, it was their parents' faith principles that were part of their reasoning for demanding that treatment which the clinicians wanted to withhold. And I think part of the ethics committee's role is to give due consideration to those values. And I think there is a distinction possibly between values and principles. And often on the ethics committees, we're looking at objectively measurable ethical principles, where values sometimes can be given less credence. But I think it's important that we acknowledge that with a lot of the parents, certainly, faith has a major role to play in their decision to either give or withhold consent.
Thank you. I would just say that part of the anthropology of most faiths is an afterlife. And of course, you wouldn't bring that into your clinical ethics committee discussion, but sometimes parents do. And in fact, one that we looked at was a concern from a dad that he wouldn't, and I'm pseudonymizing this a bit, that if he let his child go, he wouldn't be able to get into heaven and see the child. So these are the kinds of anthropological questions that I think we might have a take on, whereas other people I know would just say, this is it, this is all you got. So yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And from Amel's absolutely brilliant question to Amel's presentation now. So our final speaker, Amel Alghrani, who is Professor of Law at Liverpool University and also a Clinical Ethics Committee member. So please share your slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. So what I thought I would talk about then is a little bit about how an ethics committee has been functioning in practice in the context of the COVID response, and how it sits with the clinical decisions that are being made, because you can't really discuss one without the other. So I'm based at a children's hospital, and I sit on both a clinical decision-making committee and a clinical ethics committee. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the two of them and how they work together. So the Clinical Decision-Making Committee was part of a concerted effort across the institution to support clinical decision-making in response to the COVID pandemic and amidst the lack of national guidance there was. So it's a multidisciplinary team of experienced clinicians, and it is supported by an ethical and legal framework, which I'll come on to aid those clinical decision-making, in what's been a really hard period, where we didn't know whether we'd have capacity and we'd be able to meet demand or not. So it had to be put in place so that those most urgent cases could get the treatment they need. And in a children's hospital, because COVID affects adults more than children, there was also very serious decisions that had to be made about how to support the adult response, to give up beds for adults in the local area, and how to do so in a way that wouldn't leave children without the medical support that they may need, so that should there later be a surge in children, because at the outset of the pandemic, we just weren't clear on how this would affect people. So So the Clinical Decision Making Committee was set up to help these clinical decisions. Initially, in the first wave, it was a 24-hour access to this committee. So it was on call. Senior clinicians that needed support could phone or call a committee, and there would always be a senior clinician, a senior lawyer, and ethicist on board to help make those clinical decisions. The Clinical Decision Making Committee has a live dashboard, which does allow the committee to take into consideration the context, such as what capacity is like, how many beds are available, how busy intensive care is, staff and equipment, major staffing issues with lots of staff being off with COVID at various points, and how many ventilators, etc., were available. The Clinical Decision Making Committee, it's chaired by a senior clinician in a managerial position, and it's open, really importantly, to all clinical staff. Although in reality, it's attended largely by senior clinicians supported by a leadership team. And I think one of the best things about the Clinical Decision Making Committee is that senior clinicians and all clinicians really have a chance to share what's happening with their patients and their patient with senior clinicians and get other opinions, perhaps in a way they never have been able to before. And I'm sensing that it's going to continue post-pandemic, and that it's been really valued by those clinicians in helping to respond to that. The Clinical Decision Making Committee did have ethical training, even though they're clinicians, and even though there is a Clinical Ethics Committee, which does consider all the major decisions that come before the CDMC are also then sent to the Clinical Ethics Committee. But in addition to that, there was ethical training for the Clinical Decision Making Committee. Similar to Juliet's, these are all held virtually, remotely on Microsoft Teams. And now they've gone down to weekly meetings. So it's no longer, we're no longer on call on a 24-hour rota, but we can be if there's another surge. So just to give some more context then, the Clinical Decision Making Committee were given a form to fill in and to go through to help support their decision making. Within that form, there was space for ethical reasoning in making their clinical decision. And the ideal framework was used, which I've briefly put on the side, was that the facts are identified, so what the medical indications are. Then you determine what the relevant ethical values or principles are at play with this patient and the decision that needs to be made. You then explore the options and then come to your decision. And the clinician would fill that out and bring that to the Clinical Decision Making Committee, where it would be discussed by the committee in helping reach a decision what is clinically the best way forward with this patient. There was also this grid, which is also provided on the form, to help challenge the clinician's decisions. And the idea is that you work your way from the outside, the grey bit, and you work your way in. So you can see on the grey shaded box, what is the law? What's the code of practice? What are the disputed evidence and facts? What's the risk? What's the wishes of the patient, of others? What resources are available? And then you work your way in. So what is the most beneficial decision for the patient, for yourself, for society? Because obviously these utilitarian considerations have to come into play. And then you'd work your way in. And so that would also help the clinician think about their decision a bit more rigorously, if you like. And they would then bring their case to the CDMC, where it would then be discussed. So I mentioned, in addition to that, the decisions are then also sent to a Clinical Ethics Committee. This did meet weekly during the surge. It's gone back down to fortnightly, which is a good thing. It means we're less busy in the hospital. And similarly, the Clinical Ethics Committee also follows this IDEA framework. There was already an ethics committee in place in the hospital, but this has temporarily replaced that during the pandemic, and it will go back to how it was formerly after the pandemic. So it now meets weekly, and it's primarily an advisory role to review the decisions which are being made by the Clinical Decision Making Committee. It's a supportive role. The Clinical Ethics Committee also has an educational function in that it will offer any additional learning or educational input where required in the hospital and to clinicians. And there will be discussion about appropriate legal advice, and the minutes are all sent to the Trust Board. So just to give an idea of how the Clinical Ethics Committee works, then often the decisions that we review, they're hard decisions. They involve, as I said, I'm in a children's hospital, they involve withholding or withdrawing treatment from sick children, or whether or not surgery should go ahead, which is controversial. It could be a child that's in chronic pain where the parent's asking for a particular treatment that may not be pathologically indicated. So they're really hard cases. What happens at the Clinical Ethics Committee is we will invite parents of the child to represent their wishes, or whoever care the child is in. It could be local authority care, they could be placed with foster parents, etc. Certainly the person who's got parental responsibility will be invited to represent the child's views and their views. Prior to the Clinical Ethics Committee meeting, a clinician or someone in the hospital will meet with the parent and prep them in advance about what happens at the Clinical Ethics Committee, what its role is, and that primarily we're interested in what is in that patient's best interests, and that we welcome their perspective on their child, their quality of life, and to hear what they think would best serve their child's best interests. Obviously, we need the person who has parental responsibility for the child to consent. Otherwise, these cases will have to go to court if that consent's not forthcoming. So we do try and involve the parents, and in accordance with GMC guidance, to make decisions in partnership where possible. We explain the function of the committee is not to decide what should be done. That remains the prerogative of the treating clinicians, but rather provide support to all parties concerned, including those clinicians and also the parents, on what are the moral and ethical considerations that are relevant to the case. So in the meeting then, we will identify the facts, and there will be a really comprehensive clinical synopsis of what's going on with this patient with medical indications. Sometimes that can take an hour to go through medically what's going on with this case. The Clinical Ethics Committee will then hear from the parents, and as we introduce ourselves, anyone with a conflict of interest will declare that at the beginning. So if there's a lawyer in the room who's also advising on that case, they will explain that conflict. And then after we've discussed the medical facts, we will ask the parents and anyone with a conflict of interest to leave the meeting at that point. We will then determine what the relevant ethical principles are. So we will go through beneficence. What will the surgery or treatment proposed do? Will it relieve the patient's chronic pain symptoms, or vice versa if it's about withholding treatment? Non-maleficence, if a patient's in pain or distress, to leave the child in that condition would often cause more harm. For instance, what the child wants, what age the child is, will take into account the patient's autonomy as represented by the child, if they're able to communicate, or their parents. And often what the child wants is to be better, to go home, to be with their family. And also justice, resources do come into it, whether we like it or not, and what ongoing difficulties there will be in organising and maintaining a comprehensive care package for the child. Advanced care plans, etc., may come into those discussions. We then explore the options. We discuss the ethical dilemma presented in the case, and we may come up with our view as to whether or not treatment, we think treatment should continue, it should be withheld, etc. And we'll feed that back to both the parents and the treating clinicians. We don't make decisions, we only provide advice and support. And where where there's a lack of agreement or certainty, again, that's documented. And where decisions can't be made that are in agreement with the parents and clinicians, those cases do go to court to get the court's permission as to where the treatment is in the child's best interest. So it's ultimately an advisory role. And I think I've got the benefit of working in a hospital that has been very organised from the outset. Yeah, so I'm open to questions if anyone would like to know a little bit more about how the committee I work on has functioned. That's all from me, Emma.
It got away from me just as I was pressing unmute. Thank you very much, Mel. That was fabulous. So I'm sure there will be questions. So to our panelists, anything from you first of all? Yeah, Juliet.
Thanks, Amel. That was really interesting to hear about how those two committees work and how they relate to one another. I was interested to know a little bit more about what's been different in response to the pandemic. You talked about meeting more frequently, but what are the kind of nature of the decisions in relation to children's care that have come your way on the committee, whether it's the clinical one or the ethics one or the decision-making one, and what's the pandemic thrown at you, I suppose?
So the first thing is, because I'm involved with both the clinical decision-making committee and the clinical ethics committee, you don't have that separation from the case that you would normally have in an ethics committee where you don't know the background, the context. And I think the two working in tandem really works, because sometimes having access to the broader context can help. The thing with the pandemic is resources has become a really big issue. So whereas in the past where we had sick children that perhaps didn't belong in hospital, but they couldn't be moved in the sense of the local authority couldn't organise care, the parents couldn't take care of them at home because of their multifaceted needs. Those children had to be moved out of the hospital because those beds were needed, and they didn't have to be in hospital, they just had complex needs. So some of those cases come before the ethics committee that may not have otherwise. And I think the resource questions are questions that have never had to be discussed in such detail as they have in ethics committees. I think the ethics committee is perhaps more diverse than it has been in the past, where you've got people from different backgrounds on it. And I think the importance of the ethics committee has really come to the front in this pandemic, that people have, especially clinicians who are on the front line, have that ethical support, that the decision they're making is ethically endorsed by a committee, because they're really hard decisions. And essentially what's happened is the government have left this onus on frontline clinicians to make these really difficult decisions. And so having an ethics committee that can provide that support to clinicians has been really important, as well as for the parents to know that actually this is, they're involved. And I don't know whether they did invite parents in previous ethics committees. And it's really, for me, the first ethics committee I was in where a parent was involved was a whole different ball game, because it's so much easier to have those discussions without the parent in them, if you like, because it's very hard to say, look, this child's not getting better, withdrawing treatment is the best thing to do, when there's a parent there. And actually listening to the parents' views has been a bit of a game changer. So I think sort of things, Juliet, that have changed, that have made a massive difference, the parental involvement and the resource issue being part of them.
Thank you.
Jim?
Well, thank you for that. It was fantastic. And I think you should publish that table you used for the clinical decision making, because I certainly know it's something I think we'd find very beneficial. I was just wondering, it seems like a lot of the things you deal with are quite individual. Is there any ethical input into trust policy making?
I'm not sure about that, Jim, but I know some of the big decisions did come before the CDMC and Clinical Ethics Committee. So, for instance, how many beds should we give to adult patients in the hospital, which is a trust organisation issue that was discussed because obviously we wanted to leave enough beds so that children in the local area who got sick had a bed if they needed it, while also responding to the fact that there were adults who were sick with COVID that needed beds. So some things have certainly come before both those sort of major decisions. I don't know if that helps, Jim.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions from the panel?
John?
John, go ahead.
If there's time, maybe just quickly. Amel, when you were setting things up, you described how there is training in ethics for members of the panel. I'm sort of perennially, this is the pre-COVID thing, but interested in the idea of ethical expertise. I sometimes get described as an ethicist. I don't ever apply the name to myself. I've got a couple of degrees in law. What training is provided, just as a practical question, in ethics, and how is that idea of ethical expertise then sort of translated through that?
Do you know, it's such a good point, John, because when I got asked to be on the ethics committee, my initial response was I'm not qualified to be on either of the panels. And the first couple of panels, I did wonder why I was there as a medical lawyer, because I don't identify as an ethicist myself. And I just figured maybe they want a lawyer to support the decisions. But actually they have a lawyer. They have a practicing solicitor that advises the trust. So, you know, it's a really good question. You know, what qualifications should an ethicist have to sit on one of these panels? You know, who is the right sort of people to be on them? So the training was provided by one of the clinicians on ethics, and it was actually very good. You know, it was far better than the ethics training we give at the university to our medical students. So it was a PowerPoint lesson, if you like, to clinicians, and there was a few of them. And it broke down the ethical principles that should factor into clinical decision making, and what role, for instance, resources should have in justice. And you know, it was the 4 principles, which, you know, I have some skepticism about how helpful they are going through them in that way, but actually they seem to have helped the discussions. So John, I get the point you're making, and it's one I've got myself, is, you know, what makes someone qualified to be an ethicist and sit on an ethics committee, and what is good ethics training? And I think that's a really important point, that we need some sort of national ethical training that can be offered to clinicians, because they're crying out for it. And I got an email from one doctor saying to me, there's this ethical training that's being offered by a certain university, not our one. Do you think it's any good? And when I had a look at the university's CPD ethics training, I thought I wouldn't offer that to our master's students, let alone frontline clinicians who are making life and death decisions. You know, but where do you tell the doctors to go for that ethical training? Because there is, if you like, a lacuna there where clinicians really want that ethical training. So I haven't answered your question, John. The training was offered by a clinician and it was good.
Okay, thank you. Fantastic. Right, we've got a little over 10 minutes to deal with some of the questions that we've had coming in through the Q&A. So I'm going to hand over to Dave now, who I'm sure has had a keen eye on those questions. So thanks very much to our panelists, and thank you to our attendees who've been putting questions in.
Thanks, Emma, and even at this stage, many thanks to our panelists. That was an absolutely fabulous set of talks and some wonderful discussion provoked. There's a lot of chat, and I'm going to pick out what I take are the most important ones. Just a quick personal intrusion on the exchange between John and Jim about whether philosophy is prose or poetry. Many years ago, I had an exchange with a well-known European or continental philosopher at a time at which there was Anglo-American analytic philosophy that was marked by clarity, precision, argumentative rigor, and then there was European philosophy, which wasn't. And his response was, look, what we're trying to do is make sense of ourselves, of our situation, of the world, and you guys come up with arguments, we come up with stories. And just as literature helps us to make sense of ourselves, good literature provides very important perennial truths about who we are as human beings in our world, So he said, does our kind of philosophy. So there you are. Some philosophy can be both prose and poetic and not boring. I thought there were, I've got about 4 types of question. I'm going to try and go through the most important ones that have come on the chat. And so just jump in and answer. One is this question of the proper balance between overall national, federal, state, central guidance and guidance that's provided at a local or regional level by CECs. And it's come up in a previous webinar. Because on the one hand, what you seem to want is authoritative, consistent guidance. And the best way to get that is to get it from on top. On the other hand, you get a perennial plea for subsidiarity. It's down at the base level that we make these very difficult decisions, and you should respect what we're trying to do there. And I was reminded there's a very famous apocryphal story of a French education minister entertaining a British one, and pausing for coffee and looking at his watch and saying, I can tell you now precisely what book is being read in every French school at this moment. And not only that, I can tell you which paragraph is being studied. And that seemed to be a sort of the awfulness of central national authoritative guidance, that it just doesn't allow any flexibility. So that first question is, what's the proper balance between overall national central guidance and giving a degree of flexibility to local ones? So I don't know what, John, Juliet, whether you want to answer that one, and no particular order.
If I could chip in then, because someone asked me that question about RECs, or whether that similar approach we've got with RECs should be applied to clinical ethics committees. I think the question is to what end? Because if it's about decisions being made in a consistent approach in a consistent way, so that one can expect, so you're not utterly surprised by the outcome, so you don't get these kind of outliers of extreme kind of liberality, for want of a better word, and extreme conservatism. Maybe that's definitely what the debate is about in the REC world. Or is it about supporting ethics committees and enabling them to respond to ethical questions in a way that gets the best out of them and gets the best decisions? They're two different things. I would question whether, speaking from a set of ethics committees that do have a certain level of national guidance and structure, it doesn't count for anything if the committees behave differently from one another. It's all about culture for me. And a committee is almost entirely determined by its chair and the culture that develops around that. And obviously you can influence that culture in many different ways, but ultimately these are different collections of people in different regional or settings doing different things with different backgrounds that they're bringing to the table. And so that's where the question arises. So in a way, guidelines aren't so helpful. I think if we want an approach about consistency, then I think it's about working with chairs to respond and react to ethical issues in a similar way, rather than having a framework necessarily as a way to sort of fix the problem. But I guess the question is, what's the problem we're trying to fix?
So Dave, you suggested I might answer too, and I'd be pleased to. In the abstract, I would just endorse what Juliet said. So subsidiarity is a good principle insofar as it serves whatever you aim to achieve with subsidiarity. So I think you asked that question, why would you do this? In relation not just to clinical ethics decision making, but decision making under the massive guidance of legal regulation and so on in the times of COVID regulations. I think we have particular difficulties because health itself is devolved across the 4 nations. We see significant responsibilities falling on local authorities, for example, in England, and the structures of decision making are designed to accommodate difference on the basis that that's a good idea. But when we're looking at profound questions such as the one that promoted me and Sadie to write the thing we wrote a year ago, that was or almost a year ago. That was because this was a universal question across the country, and there was a particular organization, namely the government, that needed to answer it, in our view, because again, it wasn't about just coming up with a good or good enough principle basis, or saying, listen, let's just kick this to the trusts or to hospitals and let them deal with it. That wasn't a satisfactory answer, and there were demonstrable reasons why it wasn't a satisfactory answer. So I think we ask in the abstract the question that Juliet posed, why? And I think in answering that, a lot of the questions that have arisen under COVID cannot just be labelled as ones for local decision making, and then that draws a line underneath it.
Okay, let me take another question that's come up, which I think arose in the first instance as a question to Juliet, which is, what about the ethics of not attending to non-COVID research and making decisions about forms of clinical care as well that are non-COVID? How far, as committees, I presume, can you address that issue of the ethics of those things, the opportunity costs of attending to an immediate priority of a pandemic?
Just to chip in quickly, is that we've never had to make a decision not to review something that was COVID research. So although there was, we've reviewed 700 COVID related research proposals over the last year, but we've also done a load of non-COVID as well. They might have gone more slowly through the system. So there's a prioritization there, but definitely not a no. But one important consideration is, one of the questions that we ask is, can you deliver this study in the NHS? And if you haven't asked the relevant sites, then there's no point coming to us for approval, because you'll have a study up ready to go that can't actually be delivered. So there's an important practical question about research delivery that isn't necessarily an ethical question, but it helps us to prioritize the studies where we think if it's good to go in the NHS as soon as it's got approval, then we'd prioritize that.
Excellent. Okay, let's take another big question that's come up, which is about accreditation or validation of membership of ethics committees. I think it started with a reference to the distinction between lay and clinical members, which is the old fudge catch-all for how people get onto ethics committees. But how far would all of you address the question of, well, what validates or suitably accredits someone to be on an ethics committee? What do you take to be the requisite competence before you can serve and even then receive training? So, John, can I ask you what you think?
You can. I I don't know that I've got I don't know that I have a terribly good answer. I think what you want is possibly in line with the sort of thing Jim was saying, not someone who speaks for a particular or purports to speak for a particular cohort, be able to represent an entire population, but you need diversity in the room, in perspective and basis of reasons. I think you need members who are willing to challenge things, including the orthodoxy or what is presented as the orthodoxy. So, for example, Amel at once praised the ethics training provided in Liverpool, whilst I think expressing possibly reservations about the model that's used in application there. You didn't say it was the wrong model, but you challenged it. And I think those sorts of challenges need to come through. I think it is a deliberative body, and therefore it's within the process of deliberation that you get a better access to good answers. So I think as much diversity as possible in what might fall under what you call the lay membership, and then the clinical membership, of course, provides important practical context to the decisions that are being made. And on the different committees on which I've sat, it's been really important, well, crucial, I suppose, to have somebody who actually can describe what's at play, what the different prognoses are, and so on. The complexities, including those as well. Just referring to Amel's talk, where she's saying, this is the reason why, for example, the child is being kept in the hospital here. It's not really a clinical need at all. It's the wider embeddedness and just to create the best and broadest deliberations in those senses, I think.
Mel, do you want to say anything? Yeah.
I think someone who is aware of the ethical codes that are out there is important, that the ethical parameters that we are being told to operate in. So for instance, I may have expressed reservations about the ethical guidance that come out during the pandemic, but at least I know it, I'm aware of it, and I could have those reservations. And also to be able to call and direct the committee to if we're withholding, making a decision about withholding or withdrawing treatment, the RCPH's guidance. And also, although I did feel like I wasn't qualified to help, I think having that legal knowledge as well does help to have someone on the panel that has that. But I think that it's really important that we, as well as we want people whose judgment we can trust, if you like, someone who will, as John says, challenge decisions. And there's certainly an important role for lay people in there, because sometimes, although it's beneficial having people from certain backgrounds, whether it's a faith-based perspective or legal perspective and ethically trained, or someone that's aware of the ethical codes, it's really valuable having someone that doesn't come from those backgrounds, that as a lay person can just express their views and challenge the discourse as well.
Just quickly in relation to Rex, I think there was a particular question asked about eligibility criteria for joining a research ethics committee. We actually don't really, our approach is more about commitment and some of the things that John described. So things like a commitment to sort of accountability, being part of a sort of regulatory process, transparency, willingness to listen, act collaboratively, those kind of things. So they're more about the sort of qualities of participation and decision making that we look for in people. Maybe that's to the detriment of the membership of Rex, is that they're not actually sufficiently supported, or we don't have high expectations of them necessarily around ethics itself, or an awareness or a knowledge or an expertise, if you like, in ethics. I think there's also a practical question, is that we've really struggled to get enough people to be on Rex, and so there isn't really much of a selection process. Nearly everybody that comes forward arrives on one, and that might be that they're self-selecting and all fantastic. Most of them really, really are, but we're not really in a luxurious enough position to be able to reject many people.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that Rex do have, though, is that there is a consistent process across all of them in terms of continuing education, and it's quite liberal. I mean, you don't have to read this specific book or something like that. And I think that's the one thing that clinical ethics committees around the UK don't have, is any consistent sort of way of looking at the people who are part of them. And I would just recommend Vic Larcher and Anne Slother wrote something for, believe it was the Journal of Medical Ethics, on some of the competencies to be on a clinical ethics committee, which I think could start a very good conversation.
Thank you. I'm aware of the time, and we're just at our limit now at 1:30, and I think I'm going to bring things to a conclusion, even though I know there are other questions in the chat room which would be worth pursuing. Just two things. First, to let you know that the 6th and final webinar in the series is going to be on the 22nd of March from 12 to 1:30. At that webinar, we're going to look precisely at the issue of the source and nature of the principles that underpin guidelines. And we have, again, a fabulous panel of people. So if you are interested, please register. It's free to come along. The second thing to say is just to repeat my thanks to all of the speakers, to Jim, John, Amel, and Juliet, for stimulating a fabulously rich and varied conversation on issues, and yet again, for Emma and I, a really fantastic webinar. So thank you very much for taking part, and the usual final message: stay healthy, stay safe, and stay sane, and form an orderly queue now for the Prime Minister's announcement later today. All right, so thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.